Hey everyone, in this video I'll show you how I made this kitchen feature using epoxy and 150-year-old barn board.
If you don't like it, hold on.
We purchased the barn board from someone local and it had a lot of nails in there placed over the last 100 or so years. So the first step was to clean everything off before we made the forms to put this piece of wood in. We did have to be careful with how hard we pulled on the nails, as the wood was very brittle from being seasoned over all those years. It was very easy to dent or to break in half. For the forms we're going to be using a particle core melamine sheet, so it's just a very nice smooth surface. On this piece, however, I don't trust the barn board to harden to a sufficient strength even with the epoxy penetrating inside. So the backer piece on the epoxy form we're going to leave there as a permanent addition. This piece is going to be to hold everything together, along with having a fastening surface that we can connect to the front of the kitchen cabinets. Now, aside from the backing, every other piece of form is going to have some packing tape put across the top. That's going to help us strip the formwork after the epoxy sets. If we didn't use this tape, we wouldn't be able to remove it from the form. The bond between the two will be so strong. The thin strips of barn board you see us cutting now are going to be used as the border around to give it a full effect feel. I don't want any clear edges showing, so this is going to be the exterior of the barn board piece. We're going to take it over to the chop saw and cut a 45-degree cuts on either end just to give it the picture frame appearance. Now this is a good reference to what I was mentioning before. We're going to keep that piece of formwork as a permanent addition, and we're going to line the exterior with the barn board to conceal any rough edges. We're going to use a nail gun to permanently fasten this into place. The actual epoxy will bind the two together permanently. The next stage of this will be a bit tricky. As you can see, the epoxy will penetrate into the barn board as it is very porous wood, and it'll flow underneath. So what we're going to have to do is to put some forms on the bottom running parallel, and then we're also going to have to encase it on the sides. And we're going to have a lot of silicone joints to be doing at the end. With something of this size and magnitude, I would highly recommend doing 2 beads of silicone. Let the first bead dry and then come back a couple hours later and second up the beads. If you leave it for one and you do happen to have even a small leak, this flows like water and it'll end up being a couple $100 mistake. There's a lot of videos out there where they specifically request using red tuck tape as the form breaker between the form and the epoxy piece. However, you really only need something as easy as packing tape, so don't be stuck on solely using red tuck tape. Whatever you can use as a bond breaker between the two, so that when you peel off the form, it'll first rip the tape and then you can rip off the tape separately if need be. So just make sure that the tape has a smooth surface regardless of what brand it is. Now this next step kind of contradicts itself. You want to make sure that the barn board is clean before you introduce it to the epoxy. If you have any thin layers that are easy to break off, the epoxy will bind to those layers and likely peel off within the near future. So take a wire brush through the entire piece, and you're going to use that to get within the pores to break apart any small pieces that are acting as a thin layer. Don't use a sander because you're going to ruin that aesthetic look on the outside and you're going to be exposing it down to the bare wood. As mentioned before, be sure to flip it around right before you do the pour and do another bead of silicone just for your own peace of mind. Now I had a rough idea of the amount of epoxy I would need to fill up this piece. I also accounted for the fact that the barn board would be porous and would allow some of the material to seep within the wood. However, I was way off. So after realizing how much was seeping away within the first couple of seconds, we decided to switch up our tactic and to soak the entire top, the entire piece, within a thin layer of epoxy. That'll, one, make a consistent tint across the barn board, and two, it will allow it to somewhat harden on the exterior so that the next pour we won't be losing as much epoxy within the barn board. We still will be on the sides, however the top will not allow as much penetration to occur after this thin layer sets. So for the color of the epoxy, we decided to go with a blue tint. The reason for that is going to match the kitchen color that we did for the bottom drawers and cupboards. Now we let the first layer set for 24 hours before we start to place on the second layer, and we're once again going to be pushing it around. Now this stuff does flow like water, and it will eventually seep and level itself across the entire piece. The reason that we want to use a Bondo scraper, which is just a rubberized scraper that we're using to push things around, is to get an idea of how much epoxy we need to fill it up to the correct point. Now we can pour a little bit less of epoxy, we cannot pour more epoxy. If we pour more epoxy, we're going to start to cover up the top and you won't be able to see the barn board underneath. So we're just doing it in gradual steps. We'll pour 1/4 of the bucket, push it around, see where the average depth of the epoxy is, and then we'll continue to place some more epoxy, and we're just pushing it around to help speed up that process. Just to give you an idea of how long the process actually took and how slow we were actually moving with every single pour, it was not a quickened process. If we let it seep by itself, we'd be here for hours. However, pushing it around, it reduced the overall pour length to approximately an hour, giving it a chance to seep away and giving us a rough gauge of the height. Now once you're done the pour, you're going to take a heat gun and you're going to pass through the entire epoxy piece. It's hard to tell in the video, but there's a lot of little bubbles that occur and rise to the surface once you're done the pour. So this heat gun will help to pop them. You're going to see videos where they also use a propane torch. However, I vote against that. This heat gun is more than sufficient to pop the bubbles, and you're also not risking burning both the epoxy and the wood underneath. Now the epoxy says to wait 72 hours or 3 days for it to set before you remove the forms. However, you're going to notice that there is still a bit of elasticity within the epoxy, so I would recommend waiting 4 days, just give it a chance to finally harden up. And you can see how hard the bond is between the epoxy and the exterior formwork. We have to use a hammer, and in this case a chisel, to isolate and begin to remove the exterior piece by piece. If you take one hard hit at it, it'll actually snap the wood before it'll break the entire section of formwork. So we started off by removing the exterior railing, and now I took off the bottom portion of the formwork underneath the piece. Now for the backing, it's all going to be up against the kitchen cabinet, so it will be hidden and you cannot see it. So I'm going to take a 60 grit sandpaper pass through the entire piece just to flatten up the edges so I can have a nice clean bond between the back of this piece and to the kitchen cabinet. We did keep an eye on it throughout the pour, but you can see even now that it did absorb differently throughout the entire piece. So it did shrink around 1 centimeter from the top of where we last left the pour. It also absorbed differently in different sections, but we do like the final look. It kind of gives a contrast between the sections that have a thin layer of epoxy on top and the sections that don't. Thanks for watching our video on how we put together our first display piece for the house. Now we're well into our home rentals right now with a new video coming up soon. So if you did enjoy this video and want to see some more videos on our home renovation, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that alert button.